Hi, my name is Mike Fryer. I'm welcoming you to the fourth session of the Hidden Treasures course, and thank you for joining us. Those of you who've seen the first, second and third session will know that now we're at a place where we are looking at the Jews who are in the diaspora, in the nations, and we're looking tonight particularly at those Jews who have been persecuted, which is nearly every one of them throughout history. The first thing I want to do, though, is to recommend some books for you and some things which will help you with your study. The first book is The Crucifixion of the Jews, written by Franklin H. Little, who was a professor that I studied under at Yad Vashem, and that's an amazing book, and that involves some of the subjects that we're going to discuss tonight. The second book is by Revelation's own Gordon Petty, which is an excellent book called The Jews, Why Have Christians Hated Them? That is an excellent book and refers to much of the material that we have in the course. In the course, we'll also be referring to the feasts and festivals, hopefully if we have time. And sometimes people get confused about when they should be, what their timing is. But simply just try and get hold of a calendar which will give you the dates of all the feasts and festivals of the Jews. And this calendar, I buy a number of these from Christian Friends of Israel, who supply a huge amount of resources for teaching on Israel. So you can get them from CFI. We'll begin, however, with the scriptures, because this is the book that we must refer to. The first scripture we're going to look at is Psalm 144, verse 11. And because we're looking at lies, replacement theology, which is a lie that says that one group of people, the church, has replaced Israel, and we're looking at all other aspects of hatred towards the Jews, we read in this scripture that the psalmist says, "Rescue me from the cruel sword, and deliver me from the hand of aliens, whose mouths speak lies, and whose right hands are false." And then if we move to Jeremiah 16, verse 19, we see in the book of Jeremiah that the nations go before God and say, "We are sorry, our ancestors told us lies." And that's in Jeremiah 16, verse 19. Our ancestors told us lies, which helped us to perpetuate lies. And lies create hatred, lies create distortion, and lies have been at the base of persecution and anti-Semitism throughout history. So let's begin with this word anti-Semitism. It was coined in 1879 from the Greek word meaning anti, meaning against, and Semite, meaning a descendant of Shem. But it is referred to as something that is against Jews alone, not against Arabs, but against Jews. The first time it was coined was in 1879 by Wilhelm Marr, who was a German agitator. The term used for anti-Jew before that was often anti-Judaism. So that when we look at the term anti-Semite, it also includes anti-Judaism. If we look at anti-Semitism today in the United Kingdom, we see that we have a terrible record. The Community Security Trust, who is an organisation that records anti-Semitic attacks in the UK, recorded over 924 Jewish attacks last year in the United Kingdom. It was a huge rise, nearly doubled on the previous year. It's twice as many as we have in France, and as we saw from the demographics from session 2, we saw that there are only 330,000 Jews in the United Kingdom and over 600,000 in France, and yet our record for 2009 was far worse. There were 206 attacks in Manchester alone, and if you see on your screen, one of the attacks was outside a synagogue in January of 2009, and that was the daubing of a SWAT sticker, which is a common form of attack against the Jewish people in the United Kingdom. In London, there were 460 Jewish anti-Semitic attacks against the Jewish community. This was out in North London. It was seen on an electricity substation, and it says kill the Jew. And that is a common form of anti-Semitism. Also, we see when we look at anti-Semitism, we see that there is an Islamic viewpoint, an Islamic involvement in anti-Semitism, and that comes in all sorts of forms. One of the forms it comes in is from fatwas from Jewish imams, Islamic imams, who are the Islamic priests, if you like, the religious leaders. And they issue regulations and directions to the Muslim community, which are called fatwas. In January 2009, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Sayyid al-Khamenei, issued a fatwa, as I said, which is a religious decree, stating that Muslims should boycott all Israeli goods. And this fatwa spread throughout the Muslim nation, so that Muslim communities refuse to buy goods that have any connection with Israel. So anything made in Israel will not be purchased by the Muslim community. And that causes a great deal of hatred towards the Jewish people. So we see that a fatwa from a religious leader can be part of the anti-Semitic narrative. We see that part of the narrative also from the Muslim community, particularly the Arab Muslim community, is that Israel does not exist, that the nation of Israel is being occupied by Jewish people. A lot of that accusation comes from an anti-Semitic spirit, or a feeling of anti-Semitism, that Jews don't have a right to exist, they don't have a right to their own land. And as we saw from session 1, that actually the nation of Israel is only just less than 1% of the whole of the Middle East. And so you see where those sort of accusations come from. We're taught that Zionism, in the Muslim community, we're taught that Zionism is something which is of the devil, that Jews' call to go back to the land is not of God, but is of the devil. And that comes from anti-Semitism. But where does it begin as far as we're concerned in the UK? It comes from a community of Jews, as we saw from the last session, coming to live in the United Kingdom in 1066 and then settling in towns and cities in this nation. And by 1144, hatred against them had grown so much that a lie was told which has spread throughout history. And it's a lie called the Blood Libel, and it was published in the Old English Chronicles in 1144 AD by William of Norwich. Many of you will have heard of this. And what that said was, now we will say something of what befell King Stephen's time. In his time, the Jews of Norwich brought a Christian child before Easter and tortured him with all the tortures wherewith our Lord was tortured, and on Long Friday hanged him on a rood in hatred of our Lord, and afterwards buried him. These lies spread right across Europe because of the respect that other nations had for the integrity of the people of the United Kingdom. They stamped a seal of approval on this lie, and many other nations followed it. In fact, Spain, we see that the same lie takes place in 1168 in Saragossa in Spain, and it was used again in France in 1171. In 1255, it was reported in the case of Hugh of Lincoln that the child was fattened for 10 days with white bread and milk and crucified. All the Jews of England were invited to come and watch this terrible event. Of course, these things were lies. The lies continued through 1286 in Munich. 1490 to 91, we see the story of a blood libel coming out in the Holy Child of Laquada, which was promulgated throughout Spain and actually was part of the narrative of the Spanish Inquisition, because that put fear in the hearts of the Christian people that the Jewish communities of Spain were actually drinking the blood of Christian children during Easter. They didn't stop there. We see this lie in the last century. Blood libels continued and were published in Julius Streicher's Nazi newspaper, Der Stürmer, on May the 1st, 1934, under the heading Ritual Murder. The most recent libel was published on the 13th of March 2002 by the Saudi government newspaper Al Rihad by a columnist from King Faisal's University in Daman. And part of this publication said this: "This was one of the main reasons for the persecution and exile that were their lot in Europe and Asia at various times. These needles do the job. The victim's blood drips from him very slowly. Thus the victim suffers deadly torment, torment that affords the Jewish people, the vampires, great delight as they carefully monitor every detail of the bloodshedding with pleasure and love that are difficult to comprehend." That is a terrible thing, and that was said about the Jewish people, but that was published in London. Let's go back and look at the history of the Jews in connection with the United Kingdom and their persecution. 1066, the Jews, as we know from the last session, came to the United Kingdom from Normandy. In 1090, the first Jewish families settled in Oxford. In 1141, Jews, their houses were burnt by King Stephen. And then we've just read about the blood libel in 1144. In 1173, Jews, and in particular a Jew called Aaron of Lincoln, became a wealthy moneylender, and many of the English gentry owed large debts to the Jews, and particularly to Aaron. In 1183, Abbot Simon, after his death left his abbey in debt to the Jews for more than 600 marks, with further debts of 200 marks, again to the Jews. After Aaron's death in 1187, his money was taken from his inheritance and taken to be used in the war at France. And the revenue that he had accumulated from money lending was equivalent to 3/4 of the royal revenue for 1 year. So that also instigated a great amount of hatred towards the Jewish people, that they became wealthy, and gentry were forced to pay back the debts. But when he died, no debts were paid. 1189, on the day of Richard I's coronation, Christians burnt the Jews' houses and also murdered 30 Jews in London. There were arrests, and three Christians were hanged, but they were hanged not for the offences involving the Jews. One was hanged for robbing another Christian, and two because the fire they started burned down Christian houses. I mentioned last time of the last session the York massacre of 1190. The people of York had become indebted to the Jews for large sums of money. One night, houses belonging to the Jews were set alight, and the Jews escaped to York Castle. However, a crowd besieged the castle, and in fear of what was going to happen to their wives and children, all the Jews in that place committed suicide. In 1210, Jews' property was confiscated by King John. In 1222, Robert of Reading converted to Judaism and married a Jewess, and this resulted in him being burnt alive. The Church Council in Oxford ordered all the Jews to wear a yellow star above their breast on all their clothing, and that was in 1122. In 1244, students attacked Jewish homes and looted them. In 1253, restrictions were placed on Jews, and in particular, relationships with Christians were totally forbidden. In 1255, Jews converting to Christianity were paid a penny and a halfpence per day. 1275, Jews were forbidden even to be money lenders, so they had no occupation by then. And of course, in 1290, they were expelled from the United Kingdom. About 3,000 Jews were expelled. Then, with no property, they left all the land that they had. All their wealth was confiscated from them, and they left with nothing. By 1553, Jews were beginning to come back into the United Kingdom. And those Jews were known as Marranos. They were the secret Jews who were actually Jews, but on the face of it had converted to Christianity in Spain during the Inquisition. and by 1655, Jews were officially accepted into the UK. Jewish life after that became slightly easier, but we do have incidents of anti-Semitism going to the riots in Tredegar in 1911, and also the current wave of anti-Semitism that they face in the United Kingdom that I've just referred to. However, Great Britain did take on a major role in the establishment of Israel and actually welcomed Theodor Herz and his views on Zionism, and many of our leaders were Zionists. But when we look at lies, and that's the subject we're talking about, in the main, the lies take the form of propaganda. So let's look at some of the propaganda that we see today, which is part of anti-Semitism, but also against the lies of the Jewish people. One of the things that are being published today are cartoons that vilify Israel and make out to the viewer that the Israelis have now become the Nazis from the Second World War. And many cartoons and many things are said that Israel is now a Nazi regime. They are referred to as an occupying force, as an oppressive force. In fact, a Church in Wales leader referred to them as oppressive and racist this year. And the inclination is for those listening that maybe the Jews have turned to be the Nazis that they were victims of during the Second World War. Of course, that's not true. Israel is a democratic nation. It is a nation which is examined closely by the UN. But this is portrayed to people from all over the world, particularly Arabs. So we see that cartoons are a way of getting that message over. Islamic anti-Semitism is very open. We see in the words of Hamas that Hamas want to destroy every Jew in the world, not only in the land of Israel. And Islamic fundamentalists see it as their goal to destroy every Jew, no matter where they are, but particularly in Israel. And as you see here, this Islamic anti-Semitism is expressed in this poster, God Bless Hitler. We see here as well that in Arab nations, that maps are given to the children to see in their textbooks, and they don't have a reference to Israel at all. The reference is Palestine. Israel does not exist, and the Jews don't have any rights to exist. And that is anti-Semitism at its worst, educating children to hate, or educating children wrongly, telling lies to children. But let's have a look now at the main opponent of the Jewish people in history. And this may shock you, viewers at home, but it is true that the church Christendom, not true believers, but Christendom has been the main opponent of the Jewish people throughout history. And anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism, begins right in the first century, when the first Gentile leaders of the church begin to vilify the Jewish people. One of those was Marcion, born 85 AD. He took out the genealogy of Yeshua in the book of Matthew and the Old Testament and any reference to John the Baptist, because he didn't want Yeshua to be seen as a Jew. And then we look at church fathers such as Barnabas and John Chrysostom, Jerome, Bishop Gregory of Nicaea, and Augustine, and Theodosius the Great, all of whom were church leaders who vilified the Jewish people. Many of you will have read, and certainly Gordon Petty's book it gives all this information. Many of you will have read the Decree of Nicaea in 325 AD, which changes the feast of Passover, which Yeshua fulfilled as the Passover lamb, changed that to come alongside the Feast of Ostrey by a decree of the Roman Empire through the bishops that were appointed by Rome. And the Decree of Nicaea says, "It seems to everyone a most unworthy thing that we should follow the custom of the Jews in the celebration of this most holy solemnity, who polluted wretches have stained their hands with nefarious crime and are justly blinded in their minds. It is fit, therefore, that rejecting the practice of this people, we should perpetuate to all future ages the celebration of this rite in a more legitimate order. We desire to have nothing in common with this so hated people, for the Redeemer has marked out another path for us." So we see there is anti-Semitism, there is hate, but also there is a change of the feast of Passover to meet the feast of Ostray, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Even as late as 1483, we see that Luther, the great church reformer, became at the end of his life anti-Semitic. He says the Jews are not God's people, and if they are not God's people, then they are the devil's people. He teaches the Christian community to hate the Jews. The Council of, let's go back in history again, the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD said Christians must not Judaize, must have nothing to do with the Jews. They must not keep the Sabbath. They must not keep the feasts and the festivals. Other synods and councils are the Synod of Elvira that prevented intermarriage and sexual intercourse between Christians and Jews. Council of Orleans, 533 to 541, prohibited marriages between Christians and Jews. And many church synods take place which restrict the Jews and also put laws upon them and regulations upon them which restrict their freedom. And we'll see in the next session that Hitler actually quoted and used these laws and regulations as a foundation for his laws which came out in Nuremberg just before the war. We also see that when we look at church history, we see that the message is that the church has now replaced Israel. But that is not the only aspect of replacement theology that is being taught in the church. I mentioned the Decree of Nicaea and the feasts and the festivals. I mentioned the decrees from the churches which speak of Sabbath. I mentioned those things, and we see that throughout history, emissaries from Rome come to the United Kingdom and travel throughout Europe and attempt to change the practices of the early Christians from keeping the feasts that were God-given in Leviticus 23 to the practices of Rome, which were the practices of the pagan. And a good example of that, and I won't have time to go into that for this session, is in Whitby in 664, where an emissary from Rome actually told the Whitby community a lie about Peter changing the festival from Passover to Easter in order that they could regulate the practice of Christian celebrations. And we see that in 616 in Bangor-on-Dee in Wales, 1,200 Christians were murdered by Rome because they refused to change from Passover to Easter and from Saturday to Sunday worship. And that is a replacement theology. The church was replacing the feasts and the festivals and days of worship by the church for the days of the pagan at the time. In order just to give you some information about that and to put some meat on the bones, if we look at pagan practice of the day, we see that the feast of Saturnalia, which is our now Christmas, was the feast that was central in Roman worship. And it was the feast to Mithra and the god Cananis, and the symbols for that were the holly, the ivy, and the fir tree. The feast of Ostray was also a pagan feast, and that was held on the spring solstice, the 21st of March, and that was the feast of Ostray. And that feast was celebrated with the symbols of the eggs and the rabbit. Sunday worship was the worship of Mithra, which was only changed by Constantine on the 7th of March, 3021. And he enforced the Roman Empire to change from Saturday worship to Sunday rest, which was the day of rest for the Mithraites. So we can understand that church practice has not, or church replacement theology not only gave the idea of the church replacing Israel, but also replaced all the feasts and festivals. And in fact, we can show that replacement theology not only replaced Israel and the feasts, but also replaced the spiritual authority. So we changed the name of Israel to Palestine, or the Romans did, and also we have the center of spirituality being Rome, because the practices that we keep today are Rome. And instead of the spiritual authority being in Jerusalem, where it should be, Rome is the spiritual city of the nations. If we look at what historians say about this, I mentioned Franklin H. Little, that I studied under him at Yad Vashem. He said this about the changes of the feasts and the festivals and the names. He said it was a triumph of paganism over the Christian movement of the day, and caused the bishops to serve the state and not the church. And it was bad for the Jews. And what it did for the Jewish community was it put them in a place where we, the church, and I'm talking about Christendom, were able to say that they are devil's advocates, that their call has been finished and their battle to carry the baton has ended. And therefore it's enabled us to punish the Jewish people throughout history. And we've done that in the most dreadful ways, through the Crusades, through the Inquisitions, through all the persecution movements that the church has been involved in. And in the next session, I'm going to talk about Holocaust, and I'm going to show you that without Christianity, the Holocaust couldn't have taken place. Now, before I finish tonight, some of the information that I've given you has been quite shocking. It's not intended to be shocking. It's intended to inform you and to help you with your studies, particularly of Israel, and to know why they've been persecuted. So I want to ask you to just take on the information as an intellectual thing and not take it to heart, and try and learn from that. And I want to thank you very much indeed, and may God bless you tonight. Thank you.